Well, we are here today with John Stalin, who is the author of a recent book called Cyclescapes of the Unequal City, Bicycle Infrastructure and Urban Development. John's book was published by University of Minnesota Press in 2019. And this is a book that came out just before the start of the COVID pandemic, literally just a couple months before the first cases started happening. And I think it really resonates deeply in a post-COVID world. So it's, even though it was written before COVID, the rise of bicycle infrastructure, the rise of interest in cycling, which seems to be just growing and growing. So I'm really looking forward to talking with John about his book. But just by way of introduction, John is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Sustainability at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. He earned a PhD in geography and global metropolitan studies from the University of California, Berkeley. And his broader work really is about, in the broad fields of urban political economy, mobility, and infrastructure. So before we get into the kind of the nitty gritty of the book, let me just open it up for a little bit so John can just introduce himself a little bit and just, I think, say a little bit about how he got interested in the topic of bicycling infrastructure, sort of the motivation behind the book, if that would be wonderful, if you could start us off that way.
All right. Great. Thank you. And thanks for the introduction. Yeah, so I became interested in bicycle infrastructure kind of somewhat in a roundabout way between finishing undergrad and starting a PhD program. I worked as a bicycle mechanic for about 4 years in Philadelphia. And I worked at a shop in sort of Center City, adjacent to the Italian Market District, which is now a heavily Latinx neighborhood, rather than the old line Italian neighborhood that it had been. And at our bike shop, we mainly sold used bikes and we did a lot of repairs. And I spent, 10 to 20% of my day on a given day speaking Spanish, repairing work bikes for delivery riders, people who worked in kitchens, most of them young men from Mexico and Central America. At the same time, I was getting into bicycling. I had my fixed gear. There was this sort of flowering of sort of hipster bike culture. And so there was this kind of dual narrative. On the one hand, it was sort of like white hipsters on bikes. On the other hand, I was spending a lot of my day helping ordinary working class people keep their bikes running. The cheapest bikes that they, the best bikes that they could afford were coming from Target and Walmart.
Sure.
And they were just kind of constantly breaking down and helping people keep them running. And a lot of these young men really knew a lot about bicycles, right? They knew that they weren't great bikes, right? But that was what they could afford, right? Or what their job would pay for.
Sure.
And so I spent, when I came to grad school, I sort of was casting around for different kinds of projects. And I sort of couldn't escape the kind of gravitational pull of sort of what is this about, right? There was this emerging discourse in West Coast cities. You saw it in Portland, you saw it in a few other places of sort of this kind of whiteness and cycling going together, a white sort of bourgeois culture kind of taking hold in cycling. And I knew cycling was a lot more diverse than that narrative. Nevertheless, being a good political economic geographer right there, I was looking for the material underpinnings of that perception, right? That sort of understanding. And so that's how I sort of got my way into this field, not via sort of transportation geography, not via planning, but really via sort of political economy and thinking about that juncture of the material and the ideological as it sort of manifests in space.
Yeah, it's really interesting, that disconnect, because that disconnect rather between the work, kind of the folks bicycling to work and folks using bikes for recreation, for fun, for going to the coffee shop, and sort of bringing out, like, really telling a story about larger structural inequalities. So that's a great, introduction, I think, to the thinking in the book. So what I want to do now is, could I ask you to spend a few minutes kind of giving us a little bit of a sense of, the main points of the book, the kind of core arguments. And then I have a few follow-up questions, but I'd love to just turn it over to you for a few minutes to give us kind of that sense of what this book was really about. I really enjoyed reading it, and I think our viewers will really enjoy hearing about it.
Cool. Yeah, great. Here, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I have some visuals.
I'll go ahead and mute myself then.
Okay, great. Yeah, the book is called Cyclescapes of the Unequal City, Bicycle Infrastructure and Uneven Development. And what it's really about is in the past decade, bicycling goes from the social margins really to the mainstream, a certain kind of mainstream of urban transportation in the United States in particular, right? And it now serves as kind of a key signifier of progressive urban policy and is a key part of efforts to build a low carbon or sort of human scale city. And basically what I'm arguing in the book is that these transformations are not just happening in isolation. They're embedded in broader processes of urban and regional restructuring, the rise of sustainability as a dominant logic of urban capital accumulation, shifts in business culture towards human capital and talent, a recognition of quality of life as a city's competitive assets, sort of building on that human capital and talent type of perspective, and the reversal of so-called white flight alongside the suburbanization of poverty. And so it was really within this conjuncture, mobility becomes a medium through which differing relationships to urban change are experienced and contested. And I think bicycling is a kind of really fruitful lens for thinking about these socio-spatial processes. Right, and so this is our picture of the sort of the human scale, data-driven type of city here on the left. Very cosmopolitan, sophisticated, modeled on the sort of Northern European ideal of this, again, this kind of human scale bicycling city. And then on the right, oh, sorry, the caption is a little bit wrong there. On the right, this is just an advertisement that I saw in Mexico City. Sort of the car is obsolete in this narrative. And bicycling is of course progressive, right? Creating a better tomorrow, right? So it's not limited to the United States, but of course the United States is where I focused my research. So I explore this paradoxical moment in the restructuring of urban mobility, again, through the lens of the bicycle. Bicycling is cheap, but living where bicycling is safe and convenient is increasingly expensive. All sorts of people bicycle, but the dominant image of bicycling tends to be white middle-class urbanites in gentrified neighborhoods. Bicycling is still pretty marginal, but bicycle infrastructure is a core part of new ideas about urban economic development. And of course, bicycling is low carbon, but bicycle infrastructure is largely limited to dense urban cores that are really embedded in broader car-dependent landscapes. And so this is based on fieldwork in the Bay Area, Detroit, and Philadelphia between 2011 and 2018. So this is the Bay Area up here. This is another shot from the Bay Area of a youth empowerment organization, the Scraper Bike Team. This is a shot of a bike share station in Detroit, taken in, I think, 2016. And a sort of pavement to parks / pavement to plaza conversion in Philadelphia. And so in this book, I situate cycling in the broader context of socio-spatial restructuring, the green turn of urban neoliberalism, and questions of spatial justice and the rights of the city. And ultimately, I argue that cycling in American cities has articulated with existing socio-spatial inequalities such that in the short and the long term, the way that they have articulated is sort of undermining efforts to build more comprehensive and just climate futures. Now, one thing I wanted to do with the book is move beyond just a cultural critique. So I think it's important to anchor the growth of cycling in the rhythms of uneven regional development. Here's some context for the San Francisco Bay Area, which is the main field site in the book. As in most places in the United States, bicycling to work is more or less limited to the densest core areas, gentrifying neighborhoods near central business districts and universities where bicycle infrastructure has concentrated. These areas grew in household income, housing costs, and white population over the past few decades. Meanwhile, over the past 30 years, there's been a rapid suburbanization of jobs and housing in these areas, particularly among middle and working class people of color. This was really the heartland of the housing bubble and the subsequent foreclosure crisis, as first-time home buyers were pushed beyond the exclusive suburbs lining these corridors. Not surprisingly, these suburban areas are estimated to have a higher carbon footprint as well, in part due to transportation. And so what we see here at the regional scale is the uneven development of low carbon mobility. Now, zooming in on Oakland here, we can see this unevenness manifest at the intra-city scale as well. In Oakland, like many other cities, bicycle infrastructure is concentrating in areas that are undergoing gentrification. So what you see here is the year 2000, the bicycle infrastructure at that time and median household income by quartile. And so what you'll see is the relationship between the quartiles change as we go from 2000 to 2015. Now, these are the Oakland Hills here, the traditionally whiter and wealthier hill districts, and they have extended farther. This sort of pattern has extended farther into what are called the flatlands located in North Oakland and South Berkeley. So that's West Oakland and East Oakland, the classic flatlands, downtown Oakland and North Oakland here. Now, as we move to the year 2015, you can see the clustering and concentration in North Oakland and downtown, as well as West Oakland, and you can see the increase in quartile in terms of income. Now, in terms of race, the picture is significantly more stark. And again, notice the unevenness here as we move to 2015. East Oakland remains largely Black, Latinx, and low income, and in many places more plagued by disinvestment than gentrification. And this is in part, my argument is in part due to how bicycle planning in the US has functioned over the last 30 years. The 1991 Intermodal Surface Transportation Equity Act, or ICE-T, expanded competitive federal funding for bicycle and pedestrian projects from around $30 million in 1992 to over $800 million in 2015, although it's still only a bit over 1% of transportation funding. The new infrastructure bill might kick this up a notch, but not as substantially as many would argue is needed. To access these funds, cities and metropolitan planning organizations must form citizen advisory committees and create bicycle and pedestrian master plans. These committees tended to have been, at least initially, made up largely of local bicycle advocates, local expertise, a historically white middle class, and it should also be said male group, and based in gentrifying neighborhoods and college towns. Meanwhile, at the federal level, of course, these funds are constantly under threat by conservative legislators. So it's not like bicycle advocates have become hegemonic at the national scale. And this leads advocates to stress the business benefits of bicycle projects, rather than necessarily maybe their social or environmental value when building support. And this narrative has grown in importance within bicycle advocacy over the past decade. And so a second major element of the book is analyzing some of the origin points of these discourses of urban economic competitiveness that advocates themselves developed. And so the short answer is that bicycle advocates created this discourse in part. One story that I trace in the book is the city of San Francisco creating its first bicycle plan in accordance with ICE-T. But this bicycle plan did not include one of the key corridors through the Mission District, which was heavily used by bicyclists, and that was Valencia Street. The Mission District at the time was a working class, predominantly Latinx neighborhood, still is, but is the sort of the epicenter of gentrification in San Francisco today. Had a very vibrant sort of countercultural scene, a lot of politicized cyclists, and they agitated to have what is called a road diet done on Valencia Street. And the project was considered a success from a transportation perspective, But arguably more important, I would say, is an economic impact study done by a master's student at San Francisco State University named Emily Drennan. And this was one of the first studies of bicycle infrastructure based on economic impact. And this was focused really on after the fact business perceptions of the road diet. And she said very explicitly, she'd seen too many good projects stopped at the last minute by concerned merchants, and she wanted something to allay their fears. And this basically became the sort of transformation of the street for the better became known as the kind of Valencia Epiphany, it was called locally. And the lessons from her study began to circulate nationally through policy circles, and especially about a decade later as part of a very business-focused policy turn by the League of American Bicyclists, right? And identifying specifically that bike lanes had been good for business. These kinds of reports also began to circulate not just in the blogosphere and among advocates, but on tables at planning meetings, right? So this was at the one of the meetings about Telegraph Avenue in North Oakland, and it created a sort of political tendency toward allaying the fears of local businesses and getting developers and kind of major local employers as your sort of allies in this particular process, right? And it sort of mirrored the stranglehold that small business people and homeowners had on local neighborhood politics. Returning to North Oakland, these ideas really had a direct influence on the planning of bicycle infrastructure on Telegraph Avenue. This was a piece of political theater during Bike to Work Day in 2014, where bicycle advocates placed kind of makeshift bollards and cones to show what this street would look like as a world-class street. And after a long and bitter public process, it became exactly this, right? They were able to instantiate these visions for the street materially. And they had, at the time, business owners on their sides talking about a vibrant and sustainable city, increasing our commerce and livability, and bringing new people to Oakland to explore these neighborhoods and business districts and help them thrive. At the same time, these alliances really tended to mark bike lanes as signals of potentially just looming displacement of lower income Black and Latinx communities. In 2017, Oakland's planners began revisions to the bicycle master plan, and realizing that they had very little support in East Oakland, as I showed you before, they began to ally with local Black and Latinx bike advocates, and they ceded a significant amount of control over the process. Many of the people in these organizations were skeptical about sort of world-class anything and more focused on neighborhood social infrastructure, fixing crumbling streets, community bike shops, those kinds of things. One planner told me there was not a lot of interest in fancy protected bikeways on major streets, specifically because of concerns for displacement. The point is not that East Oaklanders were right, but that their concerns resulted from how bicycle infrastructure had unfolded within this broader history of infrastructural violence perpetrated on these communities stretching back to the freeway era. And the result was actually a fascinating project. This was on the right here, a scraper bikeway on 90th Avenue in East Oakland. And this was a novel type of bike lane reflecting local practices of these bike crews in East Oakland, who tended to ride in the center lane rather than next to the curb because of wanting to avoid collisions at intersections, right? And so this actually modified what infrastructure even looked like in this particular place. I don't think it's gone beyond here, but it's an interesting glimmer of a sort of more participatory type of process. Now, in the last chapter of the book, I argue that this sort of kind of incipient economic imperative for bicycle infrastructure intensified with bike share systems, because these systems had to more directly apply profitability or revenue neutrality to the design of infrastructure. And it applied these considerations to a degree to equity efforts as well. And this is because even more than bicycle infrastructure, bike share systems were conditioned by the context of urban austerity. There's not a lot of money for ongoing management costs, operational costs. And so they ended up reproducing many of the patterns, even more starkly reproducing many of the patterns that you see in the sort of uneven development of bicycle infrastructure. Now, while bike share systems in Europe and East Asia are spatially equitable to a degree, American cities largely treat them as amenities to attract favored populations, or at least that's a big part of the calculus. And they lack the institutional structures that would make them more effective as public transportation. And so this leads to persistent criticism that their user base is disproportionately white and affluent. So here you see, and you saw this earlier, but this is almost an archetypal American bike share location, Twitter's headquarters in downtown San Francisco with a protected bike lane and a bike share station, thousands of creative workers, and also a stone's throw from the residential hotels where the poorest San Franciscans live. But again, like bike lanes, this is not because the goal of planners was simply to already serve the privileged. Instead, bike share is really stuck between a mandate to provide accessibility to all, like public transportation, and also to be financially sustainable at no cost to the taxpayer, but without being eligible for federal funding that supports other kinds of public transportation. And so this encourages a sort of entrepreneurial orientation towards the creation of bike share systems. And so just to give you a sense of the way that they develop, they tend to exclude areas of low densities, low investment, and fewer destinations, making them really largely interstitial rather than kind of transforming spatial relations like other kinds of infrastructure maybe can. So this is a map of bike share stations in Oakland by frequency of use against gentrification risk. And so you see there's a clustering, of course, around downtown, which is to be expected. And in particular, the places where these stations are clustering are also classified by the Urban Displacement Project at UC Berkeley as undergoing advanced gentrification. They're not the only places that are undergoing advanced gentrification, right? So it's not a one-to-one, but you can see that the usage rates drop off extremely dramatically in East Oakland. And so there was a lot of effort to expand access in East Oakland, but it doesn't even really cover the whole of the eastern part of the city. And this is really because they were up against the political economy of system design as it intersected with the built environment, really reinforcing gaps in the infrastructural map. Now, there were some interesting aspects to the Bay Area's system in particular that we can kind of speak more about in Q&A. This had the Citibank sponsorship of San Francisco, or of New York's system, had really proven the value to sponsorship, right? And so Ford, however, was the first company that was really in the mobility business to sponsor a bike share system, and they framed it as a transition from selling cars to selling mobility services, right? As a kind of broader kind of platform development. Nevertheless, there was a lot of skepticism about this goal. This skepticism really reflected the association with both gentrification and corporate power. And nearly all the advocates I spoke to sort of denounced the system's expansion and outreach in Black and Latinx neighborhoods as severely underfunded and sort of half-hearted. And so these sort of two core infrastructures of the bicycle-friendly city have tended to really reflect and reinforce underlying inequalities, although I do think that they could have a transformative potential, right? At the same time, I don't think that they have the capacity to really cause transformations related to gentrification on their own, so much as articulate with processes that are already underway. But they really reflect the limits of treating sustainability as a kind of urban amenity. Now, quickly, I just wanted to conclude with where I concluded the book, which is sort of 3 lines of flight, as I called them. These emerging tendencies of what we now call the pre-COVID moment. The first was the emergence of wheelie kids, these sort of crews of youth who were kind of taking over infrastructure. In particular, this is a crew of youth taking over the Schuylkill Expressway in Philadelphia. I saw this as a mode of contesting spatial confinement. These kids are very rooted in the disinvested neighborhoods of North Philadelphia, and sort of erupting into the increasingly gentrified downtown core, and also contesting the kind of implicit bias in bicycle advocacy towards professional class commuters. The second tendency we saw, I thought, was a shift in discursive justification towards safety, maybe away from economic development a little bit. And there was this epidemic of fatal crashes in San Francisco, often with utility vehicles who couldn't even see cyclists, as well as near misses related to Uber and Lyft picking up and dropping people off in the bike lane. At the same time, there was a potentially complementary discourse of improving road safety to reduce contact between Black cyclists and the police, right? And this articulated with the Black Lives Matter movement as well. And then finally, you saw the rise of urban micromobility platforms in which the bicycles themselves began to be superseded by other types of vehicles. So you had Lyft acquiring the Bay Area's bike share system, Uber was purchasing bike share systems, and for really tremendous sums of money. And then you had even bikes themselves being superseded by scooters. And so this shared vehicle, or what was now became called micromobility, became this sort of battleground between some of the largest companies, the largest venture capital organizations in the world, right? And I saw this as a very shaky foundation for mobility, right? The sort of these very ephemeral types of platforms that could launch, but also close at a moment's notice. While COVID-19 decimated the shared mobility economy, station-based bike share actually fared a little bit better, but micromobility has rebounded in the meantime. And so it's really unclear whether this will be a bubble or an infrastructure that can really be harnessed as an element of more public mobility. And so really at this inflection point that I hope we'll get a chance to talk about in just a second is sort of what happens next with this, what I saw at the time of writing the book as really a passive revolution in a Gramscian sense rather than this sort of structural transformation.
Great. Well, thank you so much. That was an excellent overview of the book. And truly, it's an excellent book. It's like, if you need a book where you, just to kind of catch up on the latest thinking on urban political economy more generally, if you maybe haven't been really closely following that literature over the past decade, this book really does that. It does that. It situates things so well in kind of the current thinking and current debates.
Thanks. That's what I was trying to do, at least.
Yeah, so I felt like the book could be used. I think it would be a great book for using in a class, like an urban theory class, and sort of a class where you want to give students something that they're actually genuinely interested in, and to try to relate some of the thinking that they're doing and the theoretical ideas to something that's concrete, that's concrete and very relatable, I think, to their everyday lives. I think that, the bike boom that you mentioned right at the end is something I was really curious to hear your thoughts about, like really the bike boom in the context of we're kind of, hopefully coming out of COVID now, or starting to come out, or starting to the start of coming out. And COVID, it just, the interest in cycling is just, I see so many cyclists on bike paths that I never saw anyone on. And so I just was thinking if you could maybe just say a little bit more about sort of what, kind of the lessons or the thoughts, your thoughts about the kind of the COVID sort of bike boom and what it's really brought to light.
Yeah, I mean, it's been really fascinating. And I wish I in the period of just before COVID, I took a new position in a new city, right? So I have not been back to the Bay Area to get a sort of a baseline of what it was like before versus now. I was in Greensboro for much of COVID, and now I'm in Durham, North Carolina. But I mean, The first lesson was that bicycling did boom, up to as much as a 26% increase over 2019 levels. And I'm drawing that directly from recent work from Ralph Buehler and John Pucher. But it also came back down, right? Since lockdowns have eased, since, things have sort of gone back to normal. Maybe we know a little bit more about COVID as well. So public transportation maybe isn't quite as dangerous as originally had been thought, right? Which is a good thing from my perspective, that we're recognizing that. It's still an increase over 2019. So there are some durable gains. It's hard to say where they will go. The increase seems to have been concentrated on weekends, right? So people who maybe would have otherwise been traveling farther, staying in hotels, were instead kind of doing local bike trips, sightseeing, biking around to get a drink outside with friends, that type of thing. I certainly was doing that, right? And I think one interesting thing is that according to some of the research, this is coming from Streetlight Mobility Data, which is a consulting firm, that it was not necessarily the cities that you would expect that boomed. Places like Houston, Harrisburg, Greensboro, actually. And then because cities like New York are so dominated by bicycle commuters, with fewer people commuting, bicycling declines in those places, right? So it's a little bit of a reshuffling. It feels to me like after the bike boom in the 70s, right? The bike boom in the 70s, like everybody bought a bicycle. There's just, and for many people, those bikes went back into the basement or garage for the next 40 years, right? But everybody bought a bicycle, everybody was cycling, but there weren't a lot of durable changes made. There were talks of building a bike path in the LA River in the 1970s, which they've now done 40 years later. But I think without that sort of durable spatial transformation and the transformation around work and the location of work, at least for professional type of jobs, that wasn't really changing in the 1970s. That's what's really changed in the past decade or 20 years, right? So I think for it to be more durably implanted, you need a sort of broader set of spatial transformations. Also troubling is that transit usage was decimated, right? So if we're shifting towards more private modes of mobility, I think in the long run, that's a bad direction for us to go. There are plenty of people who are unlikely to cycle, but certainly would like to be able to take public transit where they're going, that type of thing. And so, yeah, it's a sort of an uneven moment. There was the big supply chain issues with bicycles as well, right? These global bottlenecks, it became very difficult to get a bike. The prices of used bikes went up dramatically. Micromobility was hit very hard, as I mentioned. So at the same time as you had these bike shortage, you had Lime, which became the owner of Jump Bikes, actually scrapping tens of thousands of bikes, just throwing them away. So it was a kind of grapes of wrath moment. There's starving people on the riverbank, and there are people dumping oranges into the river to reduce the supply, right? One of those types of things. So it could lead to discussions of kind of reshoring of the bike industry, things like that. And then finally, there was some infrastructure provision, some in the United States, elsewhere. I mean, Paris made enormous strides. London made enormous strides. Some of those are getting reversed a little bit because it was sort of an emergency measure. Montreal made great strides. Other cities, kind of more minor. Austin added 19 kilometers. And again, I'm pulling this directly from Buehler and Pucher, their recent article. New York City added 100 kilometers, is rolling some of those back. You had street closures and slow streets. The street right around the corner from me in Greensboro was sort of closed to make way. But there was some pushback of that as well. They was saying working class people, frontline workers, people of color are disproportionately still having to go into work, still taking transit, right? And the slow streets were really more about office workers who are now working at home, getting out of the house so that they didn't go crazy, right? Which is a admirable, certainly, goal, but it was not quite as comprehensive as I think was maybe really needed. And so there was some sort of pushback of sort of, yeah, this is nice for people who are now, on Zoom, college professors like me, but not actually extending these benefits more broadly. So I think that's kind of the big sort of three features that I see. And in terms of whether those infrastructural gains will be preserved comes down to municipal budgets and state budgets. Some municipal budgets and political will, of course, but some municipal budgets have been really decimated. Some state budgets are booming. North Carolina is sitting on a $5 billion budget surplus that was unexpected because of online sales, right? So the question is whether that will translate into a broader kind of commitment to non-motorized transportation in the future.
Yeah, that's so interesting, that analogy with the 70s, because I lived through that with, I remember my parents buying bicycles. Like, I was a kid in the 70s, and it was sort of this. I recently had a conversation with my mother about the bike she bought and my father, and just that phenomenon of everyone owning a bike, but then those bikes sort of just disappearing at some level, or going in the basement and then getting sort of recycled at some point down the road. I have noticed, that your comment about but some of the bike infrastructure being temporary and some of the bike infrastructure being permanent. I have noticed some new, I'm interested particularly in rails to trails projects, and some new projects seem to have kind of taken a step further. I've noticed one, there's one up in the Adirondacks that has finally, they've taken the trails out. And so I think you're right. It's very much a mixed bag, and but also just so much reflective of the inequalities that we have. Like, it's sort of, we want bicycles to solve inequalities. And as you use the term rolling signifiers for bicycles, as they're rolling signifiers in terms of the economy that we have, the culture that we have, the political economy.
Right. Yeah, and I borrowed that term from, I should say, Melody Hoffman, who wrote a fantastic book, Bike Lanes Are White Lanes. And we were sort of working on the same, kind of working in the same realm. She was in media studies, I think.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So that was, so great. A nice, just some really thoughtful, a thoughtful different lens on urban studies for folks who are new to this field. And I guess with that, I have another question I was really thinking about coming out of your work, is just to think about, like, is there a way that cities can do a better job of making bike infrastructure more inclusive? Like like you mentioned, this transformative potential, and just, sort of suggestions, tips, thoughts from you as an expert in this space.
Yeah, I mean, I struggle with this a lot, right? Because most of the book really is sort of critical of what is existing. I think that the focus on safety, especially if we take a more amplified view of safety from contact with the police, safety from displacement, safety from hardship, right? That's, I think, a potential, right? Maybe it's a slightly broader perspective than this promotes economic development. Thus, implicitly, the cyclists who really matter are the ones with spending power, or the ones who have the sort of talent or skill that's kind of slotting into this knowledge economy, right? So I do think safety, there's something promising with that, and it's necessary, right? The last several years have been really bad in terms of pedestrian and bicycle fatalities. I think pedestrian fatalities in particular on American streets. Some people have said that it's because of, during COVID, less traffic, people driving faster, which just goes to show that the other side, we focus on this little bike lane, and the other side is broad, making it more difficult to drive, especially drive fast in central cities, but
Sure.
doing that in such a way that you don't penalize the people who, by virtue of where they work and where they live, and their incomes especially, don't have a lot of options other than driving, right? And to me, that actually takes a bit of the focus off of bicycling and puts it onto public transportation, land use, especially job location, right? There's all this effort to sort of align transportation and land use, right? And we know work trips are only about a quarter of all trips, right? But the journey to work, if it's very easy to open a factory or a warehouse or an office building on a total greenfield lot that's completely disconnected from transit, and it doesn't really matter how much transit or bike access you have where you live necessarily. So there's that. I mean, there's some pretty simple stuff like extending the free bike share memberships for frontline workers, right? There were free bike share memberships at sort of the height of COVID. I don't know what the status is now, but keeping those and making them permanent, right? And more aligning them to transit where it's sort of bundled as part of transit. I've done more recent work in Austin, Texas, and they actually just sort of relaunched, renamed, but also kind of reorganized the bike share system there and bundled it with the transit system, which I think is the direction to go, rather than making it this sort of more downtown amenity, making it a bit more systemically connected. There was a tax credit for e-bike purchases that's in the infrastructure bill. I know it already got cut in half down to about 15%. So with an e-bike that's $3,000, that's not going to push a working class person, saving, whatever, $450 maybe is not going to push a working class person into making that leap necessarily, especially if they have car access, and it's like hard to envision where you might use that, right? If you live in a more car dependent landscape. Kind of longer term, expanding and aligning transit and bike share systems kind of at transit hubs, but also really working against that tendency that I pointed out in bike share system planning of sort of focusing on the center, right? Because the need to be revenue neutral, or at least to limit operational costs. You don't have the same sort of spatial coverage as even the bus system has. And while there was discussion of scooters and dockless, what are called dockless bike share or micromobility, being able to better serve more outlying areas, some of the more recent work I've been doing with Will Payne, who's at Rutgers in the Blousing School, is we found that it's not that the expansion beyond, in Austin, for example, the expansion beyond the existing footprint of the bike share system has only really been mostly going into gentrifying neighborhoods that had already been identified as areas that the system should expand to. So I think it really needs a more systemic perspective, and I think that's about sort of moving us away from thinking of bike infrastructure as a bargain, right? As a very cheap way to do environmental or economic development or low carbon policy, right? And thinking about it sort of, this is something that needs to be valued and deserves investment, right? I said it's maybe 1 to 2% of total transportation budgets. And I think really, if you look at places that have done bicycle infrastructure very effectively, of course, the Netherlands always gets held up. Those are very costly, right? It's not cheap. It's not paint on the road. It's a broader kind of spatial restructuring that is required. And I see it kind of making it equitable, especially in terms of race and class, will also involve shrinking the journey to work and the journey to services for working class people, right? That journey to work and journey to services through gentrification has already been shrunk for many professionals, right? Enabling that closer alignment of what people call the 15-minute city is coming out of Paris and some other places, But, thinking about 15-minute suburbs, right? Thinking about 15-minute urban nuclei in a way that doesn't just, encourage investment without any sort of concern for displacement or kind of historic obligations to people who've been excluded from infrastructure or been infrastructure dumping grounds, right? The sort of the converse, right? And so these are the kinds of things of, I don't see certain kinds of, patterns of working class housing in suburban areas, especially here. There's this phenomenon that I'm starting to call disconnected density, where you see, dense multi-unit housing kind of totally disconnected from a street grid, from anything you can walk to, et cetera, et cetera. So people have to take cars, and it's the sort of the worst of both worlds. I see co-locating working class housing or a very economically diverse housing with economically and occupationally diverse jobs mix and services mix not happening kind of automatically the way you see that agglomeration, those classic agglomeration economies in the sort of creative or innovative sectors, right? And so it requires policy, it requires investment, and it requires a certain degree of telling you you can't build that particular thing way out in the middle of nowhere where the land is very cheap, right? Yeah, you might want to, but we have different priorities here, and you have to work with those priorities. So that's where you get into it gets harder and harder to actually say, well, this is what we're going to do as academics, right? But I think that those ideas need to be part of the public discussion. And that's why I like the Green New Deal, some of the narratives about the Green New Deal, thinking about public luxury. So much of the transportation system is so pressurized because there's so many demands on people's time. There's so much pressure, especially on working class people, working multiple jobs, these kinds of things. And of course, that will spill over into kind of questions or issues related to a bike lane that is appearing that doesn't seem to be for them because they've got to get in their car at 7 a.m. to make the 1 hour journey to work, right, through traffic. So that's just, I've thrown a lot out there, but ultimately it really is about a more public perspective on mobility. And if that means taking the emphasis off of people's personal bikes, I like riding my personal bike, but if that means taking the emphasis off of that, I think that's fantastic.
Thanks. That was really interesting. Your idea of thinking about a systemic perspective on bicycles, that raising them up and making them something special is, part of the challenge. So yeah, I had, I guess, one other, I think, really important insight that you touched on just now, but this notion of equity and making cities more equitable. And that's something that you really brought out a lot in the book, the idea of asking communities what they want rather than just assuming a bike lane of this type is good for the community. That was such an interesting, that the painted bike lane across the middle of the road, like just that idea of that these large scale planning, any kind of large scale planning, incorporating the views of communities is something you really brought out so much in the book. And I think it really continues as a great insight. So we're gonna close out soon, but I just maybe just for maybe some thoughts just for the new researchers who might be watching, thoughts about, some new, I know you have some interesting new work on, you mentioned removal of infrastructure. Any insights on, maybe areas of, excitement and new work that you might sort of direct people to think about, just as a kind of a final question?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I feel like I've started, as you mentioned, I've been thinking about highway removal projects. I'm looking at that in the US and also in Spain. Highway removal or burying and the sort of the complicated politics of that doesn't sound directly related to bicycling, although usually when a highway is removed, like in Rochester, for example, there is a active transportation and transit aspects. So there's a bike lane on the former footprint of a highway in Rochester that I've been looking at. And so there's that aspect, but in terms of the bike literature, I mean, there's just so much out there. I get sent things to review, and there's so much fascinating work. So it's really immediately kind of leaping beyond where I was when I was putting this book together. I think that the intersection of cycling and social reproduction is really fascinating and deserves a lot more. It deserves a lot of attention, right? And social reproduction. Things like the journey to work, but also the journey to services, trip chaining, the way that those burdens are extremely gendered, and then that translates into the gendering of cycling, I think is really important. And I think we need to go beyond, well, but aren't Dutch cargo bikes so great, right? Like there has to be a lot more kind of sustained examination of this sort of the political economy and social reproduction dimensions sort of together. Again, like I'm saying, I'm interested in this sort of larger scale reclamations of urban space, but also their contradictions, right? The way in which we're seeing these now in part at a time where land values are in central cities are very high, right? And that's kind of part of the impetus in many cases. And so you could see a situation where there was a first racialized displacement due to the construction of the highway, and now a second racialized displacement as part of its removal. So that's something I've been paying a lot of attention to. I'm interested in sort of cycling in suburban areas or unlikely areas, and the sort of the geography of kind of making do in urban space via bicycle, which is, I think, different from the focus on bicycle commuters or the focus on kind of biking to the bar or biking to the restaurant or biking to the grocery store. The sort of the ways in which you get unlikely patterns of cycling in what are still very dangerous locations in suburban, exurban areas where the infrastructure doesn't exist, even just to use a street that's parallel to a main thoroughfare, right? In the kind of more sprawling built environment. And as I was saying, I think, even though I think there's a lot of problems with the way that the platform economy has appropriated bicycling in the form of dockless bike share and then also scooter sharing, there's lots of political economic problems. There's problems related to sort of data privacy, the kind of commercialization of data, those kinds of things. I do think it's positive to move away from maybe a certain degree of fetishization of bicycles as objects, right? And what I've been trying to do is thinking, instead of bicycling as, or trying to move away from thinking of bicycling only as this sort of vehicle or object or a particular kind of technology, to thinking of it as a scale, right? As having a particular scalar footprint, right? And then when you start thinking about those kinds of scales, you can think about all the other ways in which people can cover that same sort of terrain, right? Walking, scooters, kind of flexible shared transportation, but again, more on a social rather than privatized type of model, right? I think thinking through that scale and this emergence of a scale that we can almost define through daily mobility at the scale of the bicycle is, I think, kind of really promising to think through. So those are semi off the cuff, right? I can always talk way more. I'll also say one other thing is that kind of in the context of the sort of racialized inequalities, there's been a lot of really fantastic work. Jesus Barajas comes to mind on cycling and policing and sort of the deep inequalities, which is another factor that we have to account for when we think about people of color being maybe uncertain about getting on bicycles, where they become very exposed to potential police harassment, right? So that's another key feature that I think deserves a lot of attention, especially in the context of the United States. So we move away from these questions of, gee, why don't people of color cycle? They do all the time in all kinds of places, but there's a different kind of set of spatial and kind of bodily questions when you're thinking about cycling among communities that aren't the default image of cycling.
Well, that was a great overview. Yeah, I feel like if I was a PhD student and I was trying to find a research topic, you just gave about a dozen excellent thoughts and topics. And I think I'm especially compelled, just even the last, your very last one about really linking cycling to efforts to promote racial justice and as another dimension where racial injustices play out. And I think that was, so present in the book. And again, like it's something that makes your work continue to be so timely, because these are just the very issues that so many cities are struggling with.
Thank you so much. It's
So
great to hear.
I'm going to wrap things up, but I just want to make one more plug for your book. So we've been talking about John Stalin's book, Cyclescapes of the Unequal City, Bicycle Infrastructure and Urban Development. And his book was published by University of Minnesota Press in 2019. And I strongly recommend it. So thank you very much, John. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me. This was really fantastic.
Great. Thank you.